Right, I think we'll make a start then. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. This is the first of a series of sessions that we're going to be running through TED, and I'm just going to run through a few sort of areas of housekeeping before we make a start. We are going to be recording this session, and we're going to be both live streaming and uploading to YouTube at the end of the session. Also, I just want to make you aware that all of the information that we're discussing today will be used in the future to inform learning reports and research that we will be doing. If anyone has any concerns about that, please do speak to Hayden, Rebecca or Rasheen, who are dealing with the technicals today. It would be really useful if you could all keep your microphones muted to help with feedback. And if you could have it on speaker view, that would also be really useful. We're going to be screen sharing for much of the session. We've got some PowerPoint presentations to share with you. We're going to use the chat function for questions. So please do post any questions for the speakers in the chat function. Be sure to mention which speaker that you are aiming the question at, and we will pick that up at the end of today's session rather than after each speaker. The chat today is being monitored by Jane Adams and Jane Burney, and they will do their best to summarise the questions at the end. If we have more questions than we can get to, we will make sure we send them out to speakers afterwards. We have Rasheen doing technical support for us today, so if anybody's got any problems with their tech, there is information on screen at the moment for how to get in touch with Ro, and she'll do her best to help you on that one. And we're using 3 different hashtags, so please feel free to use those. They're at the bottom of the screen and will remain at the bottom of the screen for most of the presentation sessions. So I'm not going to give a lot of information about TED because our speakers have got lots to share with you this morning. But just to give you a general overview, TED Aging Better in East Lindsey is one of 14 partnership programmes funded through the National Lottery Community Fund, predominantly helping to combat social isolation and loneliness in the over 50s. For us in TED, that means in East Lindsey and predominantly on the coastal strip, although we have done some work inland, including in Horncastle, Woodall Spa and Rugby. TED has a number of delivery partners, and we form a partnership that delivers services both in terms of direct support to individuals, but also to gather learning, and test and learn is something that is a very important part of this programme. We are very keen to understand what works as much as we are what doesn't work to support the group of people that we work with. The delivery partners that we currently work with are Age UK, Carers First, Citizens Advice, Links Digital and Magnavitae, and between the delivery partners they deliver 7 different programmes of support, and then the internal core team who are facilitating the event today also deliver support directly both to individuals but also to the partnership, and gather the learning and work with the National Lottery on a more national level. I'd like to introduce you to our chair for the day, Michelle Howard. Michelle is joining us with 2 roles, both in terms of Assistant Director for People for East Lindsey District Council, but Michelle is also the chair for the programme delivery group, which supports the strategic direction of the programme. So I'd like to hand over to Michelle.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. As Amy says, this is the first in a series of learning events. And I think I want to start by saying that much as we would absolutely love to all be in the same room today, obviously we know that events have rather overtaken us. However, we really do hope that you'll still enjoy and interact with today's session. So do use that opportunity to ask questions or share your observations, and share any thoughts on how what you hear today could develop further, or perhaps be localised and replicated elsewhere. It's a really, really key part of that programme. The challenges, learning and opportunities you'll hear about today are important all of the time, but COVID-19 I think really has brought home just how important it is to support and enable people to live and age well across our communities. Over the last few years, TED has been a really genuine opportunity to test and learn what works to support our ageing population in East Lindsey. So from volunteer-led friendship groups to a range of evidence-driven commissioned services and over 100 age-friendly businesses. from grassroots engagement embedded in our place to working with strategic partnerships at a local and a national level. And from listening to people's experiences informally, right through to analysing the outcomes and the data, and using all of that insight to constantly develop, learn and improve. It's really, really great to share and reflect on some of that learning with you today. So as Amy says, I will attempt to chair today's event. Be kind, Zoom conference chairing is a brand new experience for me, and I'm always acutely aware of how much I use my hands when I'm talking, when I'm on here. For those who may not know me, my day job is Assistant Director for People at East Lindsey District Council, so looking after the services that are focused very much on the well-being and prosperity of our communities and the people within. I've had the real privilege to work with the TED team over the last 18 months, during which time I've been so inspired and motivated by what's been achieved by the team and their network of partners, volunteers, and more recently, some rather fabulous ponies. And if you haven't seen them, you should head to Twitter to have a look at them. My passion is really in joining the dots to make sure that we can make a difference for people, and I'm really proud to work alongside a programme that has not only made a difference to the lives of those it has supported, but has genuinely been a catalyst for change and innovation for East Lindsey and beyond, and a programme that spans so many areas of work to realise its ambitions. The test and learn approach has meant that whilst TED has its roots firmly in East Lindsey, its reach stretches far beyond those boundaries. Supporting people across all of our communities to live and age well is important for so many reasons: well-being, independence, physical health, mental health, financial well-being, prosperity, inclusion, happiness, comfort, the list goes on. And never has it been more important than now as we focus on supporting our communities and businesses to overcome the challenges brought about by the current pandemic. We should also remember that COVID-19 risks having a disproportionate impact for our ageing population, and this being particularly acute in some of our coastal towns. I often think and reflect about what I want for my children in life, that really being choice and opportunity, and actually I believe that for everybody. East Lindsey has an ageing population, and enabling choice and opportunity through a focus on better ageing is a key priority for the council. By doing this, we can help people to better prepare for later life. We can help people to maximise their healthy years and the contributions that they can make in that time. We can ensure that people are safe, well, connected, including socially and where possible digitally. We can help people to stay in work or return to work, and we can help people to stay physically active and to have the confidence to make whatever contributions are appropriate to them. And really critically, we can listen to our people to ensure that we really focus on understanding what is needed and how we can make a difference. East Lindsey is an area committed to better ageing, and we're proud to work collaboratively to make sure that we continually develop, test, learn, you'll hear those words a lot today, but also continuously improve, as we also prepare to apply to join a global network of age-friendly communities through the World Health Organization. We've got some really fantastic speakers today, all of whom play such a key role in supporting our East Lindsey communities to live and age well. Firstly, I'm really, really pleased to introduce Ruth from the National Lottery Community Fund. And I really want to reflect that without this funding and the opportunity for TED in East Lindsey to be one of those 14 national Ageing Better programmes, we wouldn't be here today and we wouldn't be seeing the same opportunities for our communities. So a huge thank you, Ruth, and over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat what you said, Michelle. Please be kind. This is all new to all of us, I think, isn't it? Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to talk about and give some background to Ageing Better as a programme, which I'll do. And then I'm going to talk about a summary of our national learning to date, and then look in more detail at what we've learned from areas as from the impact of COVID-19, and give some thoughts around what we think that means as we move into a transition phase. So if I could have the next slide, please. Brilliant. Okay, so Ageing Better. It's funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. We've put funding in of around £78 million over 6 years. And we've got 14 partnerships in 14 parts of England. So as you can see, we stretch from the Isle of Wight in the south to Middlesbrough in the north. And although each of those 14 is a partnership of a network of delivery partners, so it's a very broad partnership. Each one has a lead agency. It's Community Links in East Lindsey, and it means we cover a very broad range of coastal, rural. We've got Greater Manchester, so and Birmingham, so high conurbation as well. And again, to match, it shows how coordinated we are, Michelle. You're going to hear test and learn a lot from me as well. The whole ethos is to try and reduce social isolation and loneliness in people aged over 50. And in particular, to find out what does and what doesn't work. And in many ways, the what doesn't work is equally as important as what does. I've given you some, you can see on the slide there, some of our core principles around the programme. Some of the key ones being the co-design and co-production of people aged over 50 throughout the programme, and each partnership is concentrating on that as well. And to increase the input and the communication and the consultation of older people in the services that are supposed to be, in the services activities that are supposed to be geared to them, that there is more involvement there. I said we're a 6-year programme, we're actually in year 6. So we have got a lot of evidence to share. Next slide, please. So in year 6, we have reached or worked with over 100,000 people aged over 50. And within that, we've also had 17,000 volunteers. Now, that 100,000 is active involvement, and the programme has reached far wider number of people, but those people that are actually involved through interventions with delivery partners, etc. In looking at that, we've got 1 in 2 people live alone, 1 in 4 are from a BAME community, 1 in 5 are carers, and 1 in 20 have told us they would classify themselves as being in the LGBT+ group. Next slide, please. Now, I've stressed at the beginning that this is a test and learn and that programme, and that we are really interested in finding out more about social isolation and loneliness in people aged over 50 and what does and doesn't work. The whole point of the programme was that there was very little evidence out there about what did or didn't work. So one of the key pieces of work that each partnership has been involved in is a national evaluation. I'm not going to say too much about that because I know Ivan and colleagues later on are going to talk more about East Lindsey's findings in the national evaluation. But as a programme, as of July last year, you can see there that some of the impact we were having across the programme. So as a result of people's involvement, over half were feeling less lonely, less socially isolated, greater well-being. And just to stress that most of the programme is geared at working with the really entrenched, socially isolated older people, so people aged over 50. So those are, you know, just to put that in context. And also just to stress that when we designed the programme and when the funding went out, there isn't one model taking place in each of those 14 areas. It's very much based on what each programme told us they thought would work both for their client group, for the geography. So there isn't just one model. Okay, next slide, please. So this is an attempt to provide a simplified model about how our national learning links together. Each area is also doing its own local learning, which is really, really vital. And I know we're going to find out more about that later. But what we've also doing as a programme is pulling together the learning from all 14 areas to come up with, to articulate key messages. And so I'm just going to spend a bit of time looking at what we've learned so far. Now, I did mention at the beginning we've been looking at particular themes, such as working with older men, working with carers. And so there are some very, very specific learning reports available on our website, so please do have a look at those. But for this purpose, it's about amalgamating that learning. And we've pulled together, that you can see the jigsaw, to try and show how it all fits together. And the first thing to understand is to look at context. And we know from Aging Better that the reasons for social isolation are really varied. They happen, it happens for a myriad of reasons, including that kind of high level macro issues such as inequalities, deprivation, poverty, in addition to individuals' personal circumstances. And things, what we're talking about there is people's mental health, people's physical health, and their financial resources. So are they on benefits? Are they in work? And another element here is the importance of transition points. We really learned how important those are. And by transition points, we mean when people retire, if people are bereaved, to even that point where you lose some independence because you can't drive a car anymore. And those are absolutely key, as is the impact of an individual's confidence levels and their self-esteem. We're finding that that's consistently important in the learning. So all of those issues come together. They're often in combination, and they mean that people's individual situations are incredibly complex, or can be incredibly complex. And it's important to understand the context for that individual that you're working with, you're connecting with, you're engaging with. Which leads me on to the next bit of the jigsaw, which is connection. And we're talking here about connectors, and they can be both formal and informal. And again, just a reminder that much of the programme is working with the most socially isolated people over 50. And what we mean by that is that where isolation is entrenched and embedded, someone may have been living in social isolation for years. And where that's the case, and I've talked about how complex people's lives and situations can be. You just can't expect someone to be able to reconnect to themselves. And so what we've learned is the power of and the importance of having a level of one-to-one support to help that individual address isolation, and also to understand the context for that individual. And that support needs to be person-centered and holistic. So it needs to be able to link into lots of things. It also needs to be able to take the time to develop a relationship with the individual and to go at the pace to build real long-lasting trust, which then enables someone to build connections that last. So there's no shortcut to this. If you're going to do it properly, you really need to invest the time. And then the third part of the jigsaw, or piece of the jigsaw I want to talk about, is what we call ecosystem. And it's important here that we're not, because it's not just interventions, it's not just the activities or the piece of work that a specific delivery partner is providing. Interventions are important, but they're not the only story. It's about the whole ecosystem. And what we mean by that is that it's the community, really. And the ecosystem is fundamental to addressing social isolation, because it's that space where we all as individuals connect with our community, the community, or our community. And it works preventatively to help people keep socially connected. And it also has a role to step in when social isolation occurs. And it includes the interventions that people need. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm sort of need with in quotation marks. And there is a bit of a hierarchy here, because with the best will in the world, someone isn't going to be interested in a group if they're worrying about the money for the next meal, or how they're going to heat the house, or what house they've got, or if they've, if they've got a severe mental health issue. So there are some things that you need to help or fix or work with someone on before you can start thinking about making building a relationship and making connections. So there is a hierarchy there. But it also includes the activities and groups that people want to engage with. And then it's the space where you provide the opportunities and support to provide people so that they can set up their own groups. And so this is all around community development and building on assets, so being strengths-based. And it also includes, vitally, the age-friendly activity, which has got particular relevance in East Lindsey with the really successful age-friendly business work. So you can talk about the ecosystem and the things that go into it, but the other important thing is that it's going to vary from place to place. And part of that is that it recognises that to work, it requires people working together. And it's not just one organisation that can fix social isolation and loneliness. Next slide, please. So that we were gathering all of this. We've been working really hard on collecting national learning. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened. And all of the activity that had been face-to-face, and face-to-face had been really, really important. All delivery at the start of the pandemic, by necessity, moved from face-to-face to both telephone, online, and importantly, hard copy. A lot of the telephone work was linked to emergency helpline hub work. So one point of entry and then linking people to the services that they needed. But again, in keeping with our learning to date, there was a lot around the power of the connection, and that's needed to maintain a person-centred approach. And so that led to the development or extension of telephone befriending, which I know also happened in East Lindsey. So working with people that were already known to areas, as well as to new people. Next slide, please. So as well as telephone work and telephone befriending, another really key theme that we've been looking at based on feedback from areas is this of the digital divide during lockdown. And it's important to say, before we sort of talk about the things that don't work, it's really, really important to acknowledge that digital has been so vital for all of us, as well as people aged over 50, to help people stay connected and access activities that they enjoy or need. It's been a huge boon and an absolute lifeline. But we also know that those at risk of loneliness and social isolation are also at risk of digital exclusion. Talked about right at the beginning, people over 50 there's a massive range of levels of income, motivation, confidence and skills when it comes to digital technology. So everyone's at different points of the digital spectrum. And all of that, and then there are language barriers, not understanding jargon, not knowing what kit to get. It may be in an area, maybe you can't afford internet, maybe you're in an area that has very poor internet. There are loads of things that come to play that mean not everybody has been digitally connected or online. So that although during lockdown, digital has been really important, there's been a lot of people that have been left out and not been able to access that. Next slide, please. And so we think bridging that divide, some of the lessons we've learned about lots of the other work comes into play for the digital divide. One of that's working in a person-centered way. So taking the time to find out what it is for the individual that means they can't access digital. Again, is it finance? Is it lack of awareness? Can we link someone to being able to find it may be that people can actually afford the kit, but they just don't know what kind of kit to get. So can we link someone up to a digital connector to try and facilitate that? Do we need to find funding or work with charities and government to get kit out to people, or lobby for better internet connection, etc.? So there's a key piece of work about being able to support people to get online. Next slide, please. In that last, I've been talking about that it's not being online isn't a binary thing. So you know, not everyone is it a case of being online or offline. It's a spectrum. It depends on confidence, skills, finance, and geography. And one of the things we think and are hearing from areas is that during lockdown, there's been more of an incentive for people to get online, and that during lockdown, people may not have been able to, but they've now got that incentive. So there's almost a sweet spot now, pardon the expression, for coming out of restrictions and lockdown to work with people who haven't been online, to find what the hook is for them, and to support them so that as maybe having local lockdowns or as we, you know, if there's further issues in the autumn, that if we can support more people to have got online, that could be really, really important. Whilst at the same time recognising that there is a group of people for which online will not be an option, and that will continue for some time, and so that we need to maintain other ways of connecting through telephone and hard copy. Next slide, please. That's just this slide is a way of being able to show or illustrate the spectrum and covers some of what I've already said. Next slide, please. So for the last section, what I want to look at really is we've done some specific themed learning around digital connection, digital divide and telephone connection, and the impact of COVID. And I just want to sum that up and then look at what we think are some of the key things to take into consideration as we move into the transition phase of COVID or lockdown restrictions being eased. And just a bit to talk about context. And this is all based on insight from Aging Better from what we're hearing from partnerships. So there continues to be understandable fear and anxiety about COVID-19. Government gave in the beginning some very strong, clear messages about the need to stay at home, and they worked and were largely understood. And in some ways, so successful was that message and the behaviour change that it required, that it's embedded a real sense of fear and anxiety for many people about leaving their home or being around groups of other people. So there's a tension between the real value of connecting to and with other people on the one hand, and the very real and present danger of contracting the virus for others. And this is particularly the case for people aged 50 and over, as all the messages and statistics indicate that the older someone is, the greater the health dangers of contracting COVID. Also, the longer that people have spent in lockdown in their homes and away from groups and other social situations is likely to have led to a decrease in confidence and an increase in anxiety levels, so impacting on someone's ability or desire to reconnect with wider social groups or activities. And this is what we've heard is happening on the ground and is coming out of telephone befriending calls and conversations. And we already know that this lack of confidence had already been identified as a risk factor for ongoing social isolation and loneliness. Add to that that people have different attitudes to risk and attitudes to exiting lockdown. Again, at the beginning, there was a real spirit of we're all in this together and the expectation that everyone would stay at home whenever possible. But now as restrictions are relaxed, there are very real differences in people's perceptions of the risks and how they apply to them, and the subsequent levels of risk that they're prepared to take, added to some degree of confusion about what it all means. So as restrictions are lifted, there's going to be an understandable mix of responses. And we're hearing that from Aging Better areas that there's groups of people over 50 who are keen to get out and about as soon as possible, but also large numbers of people who are extremely worried and anxious about going out at all, and for whom a personal lockdown is going to continue. Then we've got people who were pre-lockdown were socially active and economically independent, who have suddenly had social isolation imposed upon them, and in many ways had to become dependent on others for food and medical supplies. in addition to the group of people who we know were already socially isolated. So there's a group that's increased. We know there's likely to be greater call for specialist mental health support because lockdown has impacted on people's mental well-being in a range of ways. This includes anxiety, depression, as well as bereavement. Through telephone befriending, we know that mental health and well-being has been an increasingly identified need, and that it's getting more complex. So for many, existing mental health problems will have been exacerbated, and for others, new problems will have emerged because of the unique stresses and strains lockdown has placed. And the long-term impact, of course, is still unclear. And then, as I said earlier, we know that bereavement is a risk factor and contributing factor to social isolation and loneliness. The experience of bereavement during lockdown has been further complicated and made even more traumatic for many as a result of the fact that people haven't been able to visit ill friends and family or even attend funerals. And this means that for many people, the grieving process is incomplete or unresolved, which is likely to have an impact on future mental health. In addition, we're hearing the crisis, well, not just hearing, we know the crisis has highlighted and deepened existing inequalities, particularly within BAME communities, but it's also really highlighting the impact that poverty, deprivation, and a lack of finance has also had in accessing IT equipment, access to food in the beginning, etc. This is likely, and areas are also telling us that they're becoming aware of people with multiple and complex needs, and that this is likely to increase as the economic impact of the crisis hits, with very real concerns for the impact of job losses and recession, particularly on people aged over 50. And another key area is the perceptions and images of people aged over 50 as a result of the public health guidance was very clear, but the main messages were around older people being vulnerable and dependent recipients of food and medicine and other support, rather than as contributors to society, both economically and professionally. And it's really important that as we move out of lockdown, that we look at recalibrating this messaging and the images and emphasize the contributions that people make, with examples and stories around reciprocity rather than dependency. But there are some positives because more people are reaching out. We have seen a greater interest in digital opportunities. We've also seen a real range of creative approaches and people looking at new ways of doing things. An increase in volunteering and local support, and a huge increase in partnership working, particularly with statutory sector and voluntary sector organisations in the way that they had to respond to COVID. And that provides a really important stepping stone for this next phase. Last slide, please. So very quickly, sorry, I know I'm running out of time. Our insights during this transition phase suggest a need for the following to help further build on this and emphasise an early learning, which is that of the importance of working in a person-centred, holistic way, taking the time to build a relationship of trust with an individual, to find out what they want to achieve, and then to develop, help that connection to happen. So the things we'd want to highlight is the importance of a connector role, both through telephone befriending, but also in making that through social prescribing work, the importance of a connector, and in addition to new learning around making it around a digital connector and the role that an individual can play there. Time, so this needs to be done at the pace of the individual, which is even has got increased resonance for us at this point, bearing in mind what I was saying earlier about the difference in people's varying levels of anxiety and risk. And part of what we think this means is there's going to need a blended model of delivery for some time. So both face-to-face, telephone, and hard copy. And that's because restarting face-to-face activity is going to take time and is dependent on a very broad range of factors. It's not just the activity itself, but it's being able to get people to buildings, provision of toilets and refreshments, etc. There's likely to be a reduction in the number of people that are able to attend sessions because of physically distancing rules. And we're also envisaging there's going to be likely local and possibly national lockdowns, so that people are going to need to be flexible about how provision of services in case they needed to be imposed. So we like to maintain telephone and online for the foreseeable future, and keeping that creativity. And we're already hearing that areas are thinking about, continues to think imaginatively in looking at the possibility of perhaps delivering face-to-face activity whilst filming that, so that you're getting both some face-to-face and that online. Building on the increased partnership working, I think that's going to be absolutely vital, and you know, it is the foundation for a lot of the rest of today's learning. And undertaking some local mapping, so the need to keep connected to partners to establish what services and organisations and support is now available. So what services are running, what are the referral partners, the networks, and identifying any gaps, so that you can start linking people into services that can provide that specialist mental health support or bereavement support that I've talked about, or have special language needs for people working with people with BME, but also and/or benefits and money advice as the economic recession elements kick in. So being able to link people into the services that they need, and at the same time identifying the gaps. And a lot of Aging Better areas are looking at how can they fill some of those gaps. So that's all. So it brings me right back to, it's about revisiting that local ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Ruth. Really useful insights there about the programme, not just in East Lindsey, but you know, across the whole country. I can see some of the questions that have come through from delegates today are looking for some of those reflections about how things might be different in East Lindsey to some of those other programmes. So I suspect Jane will put those to you a little bit later. And I think another reflection for me is also some of the challenges you've outlined around digital. We've got some great examples here in the TED programme of having really addressed and really anticipated some of those and put different models in place that can help people. And I suspect that will form part of some of the future learning events as well. So thank you very much for that. If there are any questions for Ruth that you've not posed yet, please do ask them in the chat box there, and we'll put those to Ruth a little bit later on. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move straight over to our second speaker, if that's okay. I'm really pleased to introduce Natalie Turner from the Centre for Aging Better. For anyone that doesn't know, it's an organisation focused on maximising opportunities for people approaching later life, and really having that local focus and national reach. So a really, really key partner for us here in Lincolnshire. I'm really pleased to hand over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's very odd. I'm sort of here at a conference in Lincolnshire and I'm popping off to a team meeting, then I'm joining you again for the Q&A. Life has really changed, hasn't it? But I hope to actually meet you all in person next year and actually start milling around and having coffee breaks and getting to know you all a little bit more on what's happening in Lincolnshire. So I'm just here, and Ruth has talked a lot about some of the sort of snapshots that I'm going to talk about today. But we carried out a survey with Ipsos Mori, and I wanted to present. We did a national survey, but we also did a bit of a booster in both Lincolnshire and Greater Manchester. So I'm particularly going to be talking about the Lincolnshire findings today, and hopefully just widening our thinking as well around what the impacts of COVID are going to be or might be, thinking about that group of people in their 50s and 60s now, and then over the next 10, 20 years are going to be approaching their 70s and 80s, and what are the opportunities now so that when they get there, things are better, as well as for their lives now. So that's what I'll be covering today. If you could go to next slide, please. Here we are. Michelle's done a quick, very, very good summary of what we do. With the Centre for Aging Better, we create change in policy and practice so that more people can enjoy their later life, and it's informed by evidence and what works. In particular, our 4 areas of focus are employment, housing, health and communities, and I'll explain why a little bit more. We're a charitable foundation, also very lucky to have been funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. We started in 2015 and we're expected to exist for the next 10 years to 2030. And the reason we kind of exist as well is that UK population, as you all know, is undergoing a massive age shift In less than 20 years, 1 in 4 people will be aged 65 or older. And why that's a huge achievement, we know that there's radical action is needed to be taken by government, business and others, and ourselves, all of us, otherwise millions of us will risk missing out on a good later life and enjoying those later lives, those later years. We're one of the government work centres, which basically means we're here to have a particular focus on evidence into action as well, and about that better public spending in areas that we can. A lot of you will know NICE, which is the health version of that. There's one on what works well-being, local economic growth. We're the What Works Centre for Ageing Better. Next, please. So this is just an overview about our priorities, really. We focus on what we call the wider determinants of a good later life. We want more people to be in good health and actually secure, have good social connections, and generally have lives that have got purpose and meaning. That's what we all want, right? And we think that having more of a preventative approach will basically support that future thinking, I suppose. So we want people to live healthier and active lives, because that way we can reduce the risk and the onset of poor health, delaying that onset, progression, and the impact of disease. When we think about work, if people are in good quality, fulfilling work for longer, they're able to boost savings and delay drawing down pensions, and also maintain social connections for longer as well. We know that matters. We think living in safe, accessible and adaptable homes matters, because that helps people remain independent for longer, and most people want to stay in their homes and communities as they age. So we want those to be suitable for us as we age, not just when we arrive in later life. And we also, and a lot have been talked about this already, we want communities where social relationships flourish, so that you can build those relationships now that will last you through your later lives. So it really is about having that forward-thinking, upstream approach to aging. And that's not to say that doesn't matter people already who are in later life now, who are in those older age groups, but there are many other organisations like Age UK, for example, Independent Age and others, who are doing really good work to focus on people who have missed out, and we're interested in preventing more of them doing so. So that's a quick summary of who we are. And the next slide. We've carried out this survey for a couple of reasons, really. We wanted to understand the impact of coronavirus outbreak on those age groups, on our priority age groups, and also on those 4 areas I just talked about. Mainly because the focus has it's tended to polarize on the economic impact on the young and the health impact on the old, the characterization, as Ruth has mentioned, of older people being vulnerable in this pandemic due to health. And we wanted to make visible this group that actually were kind of sometimes caught up in the middle, who did have an economic impact, were higher risk of the health impacts as well. And for whom over the next 10, 20 years, this pandemic might have an impact on their savings or on their health that would, that they would be taking forward into later life. So it was about raising both a focus, but also raising that visibility on what that mattered. And again, there's been a tendency to think of this pandemic as a health crisis. And actually, as we know, more and more, there's a social and economic impact to this as well. So very quickly, the methodology, we talked to 320 people in Lincolnshire, aged between 50 and 70 years. And we also had a bit of a focus on lower income neighbourhoods to just better understand maybe where there were some difficulties. And we also did a national survey, which is the results of which are coming out next week, that this took place alongside. Next slide. Who did we talk to? People in their 50s and 60s, obviously, slightly more from the younger group, real mix. We weighted it around age and gender. And then if you can have a quick look around different housing tenures, and it was only 2% BME groups, which is sort of not surprising probably for the makeup that we've got in Lincolnshire, but a real mix of people that did sort of broadly cover the characteristics of this age group across the country. Next slide, please. So I've got 4 areas I'm just going to talk to you very quickly about. This is a snapshot, but I think the main thing to get across to people, we'll be sharing the results of the report on this, and I think we're going to be doing more of a deep webinar and to deep look at this group with our partners in Lincolnshire as we go forward in the summer. But the quick snapshot is to show that there's both a mix of positive and negative in all of this. And there are some opportunities. I think the focus always on what's going wrong, but also there are real opportunities for us to build for the future here as well. Of those we spoke to in that age group, over half, more than half, are in employment. And actually, interestingly, and this was very different from the national survey, half of those were key workers. So as you know, that implications for those people who can't work from home was also greater. And we think that's probably to do with the neighbourhoods, but not just this age group. But I think it's worth noting that how much of a contribution that people are making in that age group. I think lockdown's been a period of reflection as well as kind of concern. So of those people in work, 1 in 5 have been thinking about delaying their retirement, increasing a lot to people who are closer to retirement. Some of those were 3 in 10 have been thinking about considering changing their work pattern, a further 10% considering a career change. So a lot of people have been thinking about what work means to them and how they might want to change it in the future. Now, of course, delaying retirement is linked to financial concerns. If people were worried, financially worried, then they might be considered putting off retirement. But also other people have been saying that actually they miss things about work. In some ways, this has been enforced sampling of what it's like to retire. And some people have been saying they miss their colleagues, their desk, that routine. So some people are saying, actually, why would do I want to retire? So it's not just about not being able to retire, but whether people want to or not. Is it called into question? The other thing, and I think that's really positive here, is the, going back quickly, of that group of people have felt very well treated by their employer through all of this and felt very well supported by people. And I think that's sort of like something that we can build on, particularly if you think about TED and the relationship they have with businesses and age-friendly businesses, thinking about actually those people who might be able to support people changing work patterns, working for longer, staying in good jobs. There's an opportunity here for us to think about age-friendly employment as well. So I think that's something we could look to build on. Going into homes next. So stand out here in Lincolnshire compared to other places we looked at, generally speaking, and this is national and in a survey we did in Manchester as well, there's high levels of satisfaction. People are happy with where they live and the homes they live in. In Lincolnshire, people were particularly pleased with their access to outdoor spaces, to green spaces, and also the size of their home. And that was much higher than anywhere else in the country. But probably not surprising to any of you, access to shops, access to the internet, especially when we're moving so much online, was a real issue. And I think there was about a third had a very specific problem with their home, noise being being a particular problem for many people, being shut in all day in their own homes. And for those people in more vulnerable groups, people whose health had been impacted or mental health had been impacted, or were renting, they were more likely to have a problem with their home. So that is worth thinking about. So those general satisfaction, there were some issues. And rather than moving home, or a lot of people are thinking to do work to their home in the future and to try to get to some of those problems. So there's an opportunity again around housing adaptations, around also not just looking at people who are vulnerable, people who might want to make positive changes now for where their homes are going to be, where they spend more of their time in the future. So opportunity to work with landlords, support and advice on finding tradespeople and making good adaptations and amendments to home. There's also an opportunity to lobby for around the role of IT infrastructure as well, like never before, with that focus on IT and actually that unequal access to it that's available in Lincolnshire. I think this is a real opportunity for pushing for that and pushing for better support for people who aren't online. Going next. Community, I won't go too much into detail of this because Reece talked a lot about what we've found about here. You know, we're changing the way we communicate. That's really clear. For those people who've been able to video. People have moved to video in a dramatic way. I think 78% of more conversations by video than ever before, and often for the first time. There's only a small proportion who don't have face-to-face contact, and I thought it was interesting as well. In Lincolnshire, where in theory there just are fewer people, it's more sparse, it's smaller communities, there was more face-to-face contact than there were in urban areas. So there seems to be that sort of social capital here that was something we could really, we could see as different from both the national and also Greater Manchester survey. It's also the contribution that was being made by this, again, that Ruth has sort of, to build on what Ruth was saying, about nearly 40% have been volunteering formally or informally, and over half will say they're definitely going to continue. And many of them already were volunteering, but some others for whom it was for the first time. There's something else that's crept in a little bit, and that I think again is thinking about ageism and how older people are talked about in the context of this crisis. That just over nearly 40% believe that the media portrayal has been unfair. I don't need to tell a lot of you on this call to say that the opportunity here really is about building on that volunteering and about the visibility of that group of people who are contributing to their communities and supporting that to happen. And also the support, the contribution that people in that age group are making as key workers as well, I think is really important. Finally, a quick snapshot on the health of people. Now, this is a real mix again, positive and negative, and we aren't able to drill down into the figures too much. This is such a snapshot, but about 1 in 5 have had a physical health has been impacted, and about a third are saying that it's impacting on their mental health. Smoking more, exercising less often, but there were also chunks of people who had used this lockdown experience as an opportunity to get on top of their, change their diet, change the way they were exercising, going for walks more often, and sometimes having more communication as well with other people than before. So it's a real mixed picture. We know it's been a lot in the news at the moment around how many have had a medical appointment cancelled or delayed. That's a concern, as is deconditioning, that what we call that, where people have been out and about less physically during the lockdown period. But we're also kind of, as we move through lockdown and people know this is going to go on for longer, we do kind of think that we need to think differently about how people access health services going forward. Of course, there's an issue around IT infrastructure and sparsity and getting to places, but telecare, video calls with doctors, etc., there's a real opportunity to accelerate those trends and respond to groups of people who are accessing online more often and yet who may not be able to get to medical appointments as normal. So again, so a real mix of ups and downs, but we are hoping to go back and do more work around this age group, combining that with thinking about people who are already in their 70s and 80s and 90s will give us a much more nuanced picture of this crisis as we're in it and as we emerge from it for all age groups, because it's all very different for everyone, and also people within generations, not just between generations. There are big differences on those who are doing okay and those who aren't, and we need to know more about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Natalie. That's really, really helpful, and I'm particularly interested to do the compare and contrast between a rural and coastal area like Lincolnshire compared to places like Manchester. I can see a number of people asking for the slides and perhaps more information about the research when it's available, so that'll be of real interest to many of our delegates today. So thank you very much for that. I know, having delivered the TED programme for a number of years now, we talk about that test and learn, and I know for many of you, you'll be really interested in the so what. So what have we learned? What has emerged? What difference has it made? And actually how might it inform what we do next in East Lindsey, but perhaps what other people might do next in other areas. So our next speakers will share some insights with you, which I really hope will be helpful in terms of what's been learned and actually what we could do with that moving forward. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ivan Annable from Rose Regeneration and Liz Price from the University of Lincoln Business School. I'm not quite sure who's going first, but over to you guys. I know you've been really engaged with the TED team. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go first. Is that all right with you, Ivan? That's the order in which our slides go anyway.
That's fine, yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the statistical information, providing really an overview from the local analysis of the Common Measurement Framework, which is the survey that Ecoris does on a national scale, looking at the dashboard that they produce to look at some kind of key findings locally, and also the results of some inputting that community links have been doing, really to prioritise a number of follow-ups to the Ecoris survey to really understand change over time amongst the participants of TED. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some research that my colleague Jennifer Jackson at the university has undertaken with participants, some qualitative telephone interviews in April and May this year. And then I'm going to hand over to Ivan, who's going to talk a bit about social return on investment and the wider economic context. So if we look at the results from the dashboard, this is the results that we get from the Common Measurement Framework. And I've just pulled out some headlines here. So last year we worked with Community Links to produce an impact card, which kind of compared some of the data that was being produced nationally to kind of show what Ageing Better was achieving with what TED East Lindsey was achieving. And there were some similar types of figures as is shown in this slide here. So we can look at it in a number of themes really. If we look at it in terms of social activities and volunteering, we can see that quite a high proportion of the participants were able to say that they continued or increased these kinds of activities, such as memberships of clubs and societies and volunteering, and that there was generally an upward trend between the first survey they completed when they were participating in TED and then the follow-up. So really between sort of 69 to 73%. If we look at health and well-being, health indicators generally are a little bit lower. But around half, just over half, were able to say that their health and well-being improved or stayed the same. And then in terms of them being able to feel that they could personally influence local decisions, 62% felt that that improved or stayed the same. And then the final column really refers to the general trend between entry and follow-up. So we can see that the social activities are kind of the standout kind of things that people feel are most improved in a way through taking part in TED, and that there's a positive trend there. The health is a bit more of a divided picture, and there's people feel that they can, or some feel that they're able to improve their ability to influence decisions, but it's less of a clear picture with a bit of a negative trend between entry and follow-up. I think what we have to be careful with looking at this data as well is be inferring causality too much. So because none of these variables are actually linked back directly to the TED programme, we can't say that it's a result of TED that these have occurred, but we can perhaps, we just have to be careful with making those inferences. So next slide, please. So looking at the TED participants, what we found is that looking at where the participants live by multiple deprivation decile, so these really focus on how deprived each area is in relation to the index of multiple deprivation nationally. What we found was that 2/3 of the participants were living in areas that are identified as the top 30% most deprived across the country. And we know that some settlements in East Lindsey, such as Mablethorpe, Skegness, Ingermells, really are some of the most deprived in the country, most generally, but also in terms of health amongst the general population as well. So the project is definitely targeting and delivering to those residents in those areas. Ruth mentioned about the proportion of people that were carers that lived alone nationally, and that those figures are kind of reflected as well in Lincolnshire. So 1 in 5 as nationally are carers, just under half live alone, so that's quite similar to the national picture, and around half have an illness or disability. So the next slide, please. So we've started looking at the data that Community Links have been inputting, Lisa at Community Links has been inputting follow-up surveys up to about six follow-ups per participant. So we've been able to look at change over time. And what we found is that on a number of variables, there is an increase between the first questionnaire and then the first follow-up and the second follow-up. So there seems to be a bit of a step change as a result of participating or after participating in the programme. And then after that, the change kind of falls away somewhat. And this really could be because perhaps it's perceived as kind of a step change at first, and then they perceive there to be less of a change as time goes on and it becomes more of a part of their life. Also, with later follow-ups, there are fewer surveys, so we have less confidence in those results as well. So we can see that at least for the first two follow-ups, there's this increase in health, in perceived health state. And we also see other variables playing a role. So if we look at the graph on the right-hand side here, we can see that those who live alone, there's a kind of a bigger change between the entry and the follow-up than those who live with a spouse or with family, who kind of maintain more of a steady picture of their own health. And then those who live alone, it kind of increases and then it wanes a little bit more as well. So I think there's a difference between participants depending on their circumstances, and the nature of their circumstances may determine how much of a difference TED makes to them as well. So next slide, please. So looking at a number of other variables. So here we have, on a 5-point scale, we have optimism and engagement in social activities, and on a 3-point scale, we have isolation. And what we found is that there was sort of a slight increase in optimism and engagement in social activities amongst the participants over the first 3 follow-ups. Isolation is a little bit more static, and we know from previous research that sometimes after participating in programs like this, there can be an increase in reported sense of isolation, simply because participants become more aware of the fact that they're socially isolated. Perhaps they've been asked about it through questionnaires, they're talking to people about their circumstances, and so they actually become more reflective about it. And I think with all of this data, we're very mindful that a trend that is kind of quite flat, or that is only showing a slight increase, is actually a positive outcome, because it's about maintaining or slightly improving residents' circumstances, some of whom, as we've heard today, may be in quite difficult situations in regards to their health, their finances, how isolated they feel. So I think we always have to look at these in the context of the individual and their circumstances. So that's just a bit of a snapshot from the data. The inputting continues on this, and we hope that when we get a large enough, at the moment there's around 200 entries on this, we hope when we get a sufficient number, we'll be able to provide a breakdown by delivery partner and by a number of other variables as well, which will provide really useful insight into the effect of the different activities on TED on the participants. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about the qualitative interviews now. So in April and May this year, Jennifer undertook 13 telephone interviews with TED participants on the activities that you can see on the slide. And I just want to say thank you so much to the delivery partners who helped Jennifer with this, as it was sort of undertaken during lockdown, so we had to go through the process of obtaining consent to have the interviews done by telephone rather than as part of a focus group. And the interviews explored a number of issues, such as how the participants became engaged in the projects, their experiences of the projects, and their reflections on TED overall, including where there could be some development. So next slide, please. So here are some of the themes of the interview. So in terms of reasons for taking part, one of the main reasons was really wanting to go out and meet people. Some wanted to provide support for others, and the activities themselves, so what was being delivered was actually a big driver of taking part. Also the nature of the activities, the structure of them, and the different stages in participants' lives. And I think we found that there was sort of a push element and a pull element. So some identified that they were not getting out much, were feeling a little bit isolated, that they would benefit from taking part in a group activity. Others were sort of pulled by the nature of the activity and the fact that they found that appealing and wanted to learn something new that was being offered. In terms of how people became aware of the project, well, it seemed as if they had multiple routes and multiple methods of having become aware of the project. So general publicity was quite important, and a number had been signposted through existing groups and connections such as the church, University of the Third Age, care organisations. For some, having family or friends to attend with helped, and then those, I think there was some concerns raised by some about, well, we were a bit apprehensive about attending, we didn't know what to expect, it was a bit scary, but then when they got there they found the nature of the projects very non-threatening and wondered why they had felt scared. As I mentioned, the value of the activity itself was quite a core theme in some of the interviews, so the opportunity also for socialising was important, and also the role of the project worker was key in engaging and supporting participants as well within the projects. So next slide, please. So just to illustrate this kind of central nature of the activity itself, I won't read through these quotes, but I think they just illustrate how much participants get from each of these activities. So looking at fitness, food and friends, people really talked about the fact that it's really nice to learn, you know, new cookery skills, new very specific information about health. They talked about, for example, learning to use new ingredients such as fresh tuna, which they'd never used before. So there's a lot of people who have been very inspired by what was covered in those sessions. We've talked a little bit today about the digital divide, the rural digital divide, and the people who attended Links Digital talked about the fact that there was it catered for quite a variety of different abilities, that they might have felt a bit intimidated by technology before going, but they found that it really helped them and overcame some of their fear, for example, around online banking, cybersecurity, that kind of thing. And as you can see, this person talked about, I was able to walk around Armenia. I would love to go. I never will go, but I was able to see it because of accessing it through this class. And then the Men Do and the Chaps activities were focused on men, and they talked a lot about how, for example, with the Men Do, they'd never been to anything quite like it, so they'd sort of gone to various different places as part of this activity, such as Bomber Command, Cadwell Park. It felt like a real break for them as carers. And also the Chaps participant talked about how, you know, it's quite unusual to have a group where it's dedicated to men and men socialise in a very different way, and it's really nice to have that opportunity to have that relaxed atmosphere to socialise with other men of their own age. So final slide for me, please. In terms of the impact of TED, it seemed that the impact was quite interconnected. So people talked about the improvements to their health and well-being, and also friendship and community and skills and interests, but these things seem to kind of reinforce each other. So, you know, improving friendships and community helped with a sense of well-being and so on. Some developed close personal relationships, some who already knew people in the community, it helped cement those existing relationships. So there's this term bonding and bridging social capital in terms of kind of reinforcing who you know and then helping you reach out to people you don't know. There was some discussion around support during COVID, so participants really appreciated the ongoing support that project workers provided to them during the lockdown, such as the weekly telephone calls, the online activities. And some talked about the fact that they were continuing their activities at home. So the fitness, food and friendship groups, for example, were, you know, some of them were still doing their exercises, they were still using the recipes that they'd learnt. Some of the men's groups were still doing their online quizzes. But a lot also talked about the fact that the lockdown had reinforced the value of the project. So they really missed being out and about. They missed the structure that the projects provided for them. So in some ways, the lockdown kind of reinforced the value of these in bringing people close, close together, and providing an opportunity for socialising in person. And that was really missed, and people were looking forward to getting back to that. In terms of recommendations for improvements, generally participants were very positive about the project. They talked about perhaps how, in terms of marketing, the more traditional forms of marketing were perhaps most effective. So sort of old-fashioned approaches such as flyers and newsletters to reach the older generation, rather than online approaches or alongside online approaches. Some talked about, well, we were able to access the activity because we live in such a place, but would people who live in very rural areas, would the very vulnerable who don't drive, would they be able to reach those? And they also talked about the opportunity to participate in decisions about project opportunities, project activity, and welcome the opportunities to be proactive in supporting others in their group. So I'll hand it over to Ivan now.
Thank you very much, Liz. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Just before I jump into this presentation, I'm just reflecting back on 30 years of doing this kind of stuff and remembering very clearly that at one stage we used to just get on with it. We didn't really kind of measure or reflect on what we were delivering at all. And we've had 3 speakers now who've taken us through an incredibly concentrated and intense process of reporting back on things. And I'm going to gild the lily even further, but I think it'd be interesting at some stage to almost reflect on the depth of our measurement and whether that's almost as big an activity as delivering itself. But anyway, there's a bit of a controversial aside for you. So the first part of my presentation is about the social value delivered by TED. And social value is a well-known concept now, but just for those of you who aren't fully aware of what it's about trying to get to the nub of those things that we know are important, but we're not able to traditionally measure. And there are a couple of quotes here, one from a former MP and social value ambassador, who talks about it being about the social, environmental and economic well-being that's delivered. And then from Social Value UK, which is the national body that oversees social value, they talk about quantifying the relative importance that people place on the changes they experience in their lives. And to me, why social value is important is that statistics can sometimes be a bit disempowering, and they can sometimes focus on what's easy to count rather than what's important to count. And through social value, we try and focus on what's important to count. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what's important to count is the impact of something on a place. And when we undertake social value, we use a tool called the Social Value Engine. You'll see there's a little logo on the top of the left-hand side of the slide as we look at them, that looks at things that are achieved by a programme, and it identifies for each important thing that's been achieved something called a financial proxy. And that is a statistic which has got some provenance in public policy study. It's either been generated by a university or other higher educational or further educational body, or it's been generated by government, which enables us to say the value of something, for example, like feeling you belong in your neighbourhood, is £2,000 or £5,000. We've got 200 odd different financial proxies we can apply to different impacts. But when we're thinking about the impact some things had, it's not just the people that are important, it's the place. And so all the different 200 financial proxies we have are tied back to something called the Bristol Accord, which is a means of understanding what makes a place sustainable. And this sort of dartboard type diagram explains how the Bristol Accord works. It conceptualizes sustainable places in the context of 8 different domains, and they're set out there close to the heart of the dartboard, their governance, transport, services, etc. So what we've done with TED is we've sat down with the different providers, and several people have talked about them and what they do. We've identified the detail of what they've achieved. We've identified the volumes, the number of people that they've had an impact on through those achievements. And then we've mapped them back to the relevant one of the 8 of these different domains to give a report that says, this is the really deep-seated impact that TED's had. So if I could have the next slide, please. And this is just to remind you of the key projects that we've been working with and the things that they've been doing. So on the left, you've got the delivery organisations, and on the right, you've got the activities they'll be undertaking. So can we have the next slide, please? And this slide shows you the results of what's been said so far. So on the left, you can see a pie chart, and that pie chart basically says, for the total social value delivered, and on the right you can see that's written there as a net present value, that's £672,000 worth of value to society. What particular areas of impact has TED had? And you'll see that it's delivered £164,000 worth of value in terms of people being active, inclusive and safe. It's contributed £160,000 towards things being well run. It's contributed £243,000 of social value to people being connected. It's delivered £41,000 of contribution to fairness and decency in society. And it's delivered £76,000 worth of value in terms of people being well served. And if you top that lot up, and over the period we looked at, divide it by the amount that's been spent by the different organisations delivering it, this suggests that TED has delivered just over £11, £11.20 for each pound of public expenditure. And that's a really interesting way of thinking alongside some of the other more detailed examples, both looking at the Ageing Better programme across the whole of England and things it's been doing, looking at some of the issues that Liz talked about that have come out of looking at the individual experience of participants. This is looking at the contribution to society and to place. And if you or I were to invest £1 and get £11.20 back for it, we'd be very pleased. That's not cause for complacency, but it just shows you quite interestingly both the scale of social impact that Better's had, that TED has had, and also the way that impact has been distributed. So if we could have the next slide, please. TED isn't operating in a vacuum, and what we're undertaking as a team is called a formative evaluation. So that means effectively that we sit alongside the people delivering TED as it evolves, and we respond to issues and circumstances as they crop up. The great benefit of that is that we can review progress as we make it, and we can hold a mirror up to the people delivering TED and help them think about where they've got to and where they're going to next. And the reason that we have included this slide is that none of us, when we agreed that methodology, appreciated that we would have the coronavirus. And that's led us to step back slightly from our more routine activities and think about aspects of the impact of the coronavirus on things that TED does. So these two charts just give you a flavour of what's happening, and none of this will be news, but it is in a Lincolnshire context. So the slide on the left is about central Lincolnshire, but it shows you how unemployment has really radically, and we're looking at statistics here for April 2020, gone up. It's ratcheted up, virtually doubled in those 3 districts. And then if you look at the slide on the chart on the right, it shows you effectively month by month how things have changed. And in the context of TED, you'll see that it's really significant in relation to East Lindsey. And that's because the particular mix of employment in East Lindsey around tourism and hospitality has meant that that's really been very badly affected as a place. And condition, the nature of the quality of people's lives in East Lindsey, both in terms of spend, but also in terms of available employment. And we're at the start of this. It's going to things are going to unravel further as we go forward. I'm not normally a doom monger, but it's quite interesting just to look at this and to think about TED and its delivery mechanisms in that context. So could I have the next slide, please? And effectively the pressures on organisations, and this includes the organisations delivering TED, as a consequence of the coronavirus, are what I have called the unvirtuous triangle. This little diagram sets it out here. So we've got service pressure because people have become challenged in a whole range of ways by coronavirus and their needs have gone up. We've got reduced opportunities to provide services because the old models of unsocially distant support don't work particularly well. And we've also got threats to the viability of the different organisations delivering TED services. And when you put those three things together, it really does put some significant pressure, not just on TED delivery organisations, but on the broader infrastructure of organisations getting on with their day-to-day business in the TED geography, including businesses themselves. Now, one of the key projects that TED delivers is age-friendly businesses. And so against the background of this development, we thought we'd try and look in as a key package within the formative evaluation, because it'll help inform our thinking going forward, on what was happening to our age-friendly businesses. So could I have the next slide, please? So we managed to get on the telephone these businesses. They're all age-friendly businesses operating in East Lindsey, key players within the overall TED framework of that programme. And I have to say, to get this range of businesses to respond to the telephone when they've got other bigger challenges to do shows what a courteous and decent environment we live in terms of our business infrastructure. Next slide, please. And what those interviews also revealed, and I sometimes start to wonder if there's a bit of a divergence between what we're told nationally and what we know locally, is a far greater amount of resilience within the business community than you might have inferred from those statistics I showed earlier and from the sort of general doom mongering that goes on. And I would characterise this as most of these businesses fighting their way back to a position of some stability. So the vast majority of those businesses are still trading. The vast majority have been able to make significant and value-adding changes to their delivery approaches. There's some real, notwithstanding that business is meant to be competitive, mutual aid and working together amongst those age-friendly businesses to really help each other. And the other thing that's positive in terms of TED clients is that a lot of them have delivered a bespoke approach to providing services, because getting people to queue up or come into your shop in the normal way doesn't work. So you have to think much more carefully about how you provide a service directly to them. The negative of that is that that service redesign has been driven mainly by keeping people apart and distant. And of course, when you isolate things, particularly when you're dealing with, in some cases, lonely and vulnerable people, that makes them more lonely and more vulnerable. And I think we know from national studies that mental health challenges are going to be some of the biggest challenges that we face as a long-term undertow from the coronavirus. We asked them rather bravely, because we didn't really have a lot of resource, but what TED could do to help. And interestingly, there were no big ticket demands from these organisations to say anything like, oh, could you give us a load of money? Because we wouldn't have been able to anyway. But there were some interesting opportunities that they identified. And if we could have the next slide, please. So some of the key things that we need to think about how TED, in terms of age-friendly businesses going forward, and some of the things it can do to support them, that came out of that ask is, first of all, there's something to build on in terms of the resilience that currently exists. We're not here on a mission to try and replace stuff that's gone. We're here to work with organisations that have been challenged. Some form of marketing and promotion of services of the businesses as the pandemic continues will be helpful. That's a key priority for them. Secondly, there are some really interesting opportunities to develop further the interface between good neighbour and community response initiatives, and making these age-friendly businesses more accessible through the services they provide and the work that people have done to actually do things like deliver groceries, take people to appointments, etc. That was a stock in trade of TED, and I think this has demonstrated how it can be built on and consolidated. we've heard earlier about digital exclusion, and it's very clear that building the capacity of these businesses to operate digitally, but also of TED clients to respond to them, is a real issue. And I think because TED is very good at networks, pulling together a network amongst businesses over and above the current things that they get to actually do some future scoping and future gazing about how we structure things going forward in terms of that whole new series of learning about how businesses interact with TED clients is a really interesting thing to do. So next slide, please. There you go. So that's me finished. Thank you very much indeed for listening. It's not very often I'm upstaged by a cup of tea, but on this occasion I have to acknowledge its superiority. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for that, Ivan, and also to Liz. That's been really, really helpful, and I'm sure there'll be some questions from our delegates around some of the insights there. Okay, so I think we are running perfectly on time, which is quite an achievement, I think, particularly doing this for the first time via Zoom. So if you want to just mute your microphones and just minimise your cameras for now, go and get yourselves a cup of tea, and we'll see you back here at 3:05 when I will hand over to Hayden to talk about some of the other learning from TED. So thank you. In the break, if you do have any questions, please do take the opportunity just to post those also. So thank you very much.
Well, I hope everybody has had a chance to get a cup of tea and we're all feeling really refreshed now. And I hope that you also had time to see some of the video that's been playing quite quietly in the background while we've all been refreshing ourselves. Some quite interesting photographs of some of the activity that's been happening recently, but also some really lovely poems that have been written by some of our TED members and beneficiaries that really illustrate the importance of the work of TED. I'm going to hand back over to Michelle now, and she's going to introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I don't know about you, but I did manage more than one biscuit in that refreshment break, and I won't feel guilty about that. I'm really pleased to hand over to Hayden next, really staying on the subject of learning, insights and evaluation. Hayden's a really key member of the TED team and the author of many of the learning reports, which I hope you'll find the time to have a look at on the website after the event today. So over to you, Hayden.
Thank you. Our presentation today draws on a number of kind of evaluation activities that have been done in TED, and I've kind of put these into a thematic structure. So some of the learning comes from the exercises that we've done prior to COVID, from programme inception onwards. And it's also informed by some recent fieldwork activity that we've done, including focus groups with beneficiaries immediately prior to lockdown, some telephone interviews with staff and volunteers during shielding and isolation, and also a series of project delivery case studies that were issued to all our delivery partners during the early stages of COVID. A number of these things that I talk about today are also included in a recent report, which was themed on COVID and resilience in our communities and individuals. I should also just mention that the communities team has also undertaken a recent mapping survey exercise by Lincolnshire funded by Lincolnshire Community Foundation, and this included an online survey of over 90 people aged 50 and over in Lincolnshire. It also revealed that 76% of these respondents had given support to their friends or neighbours during the pandemic. However, it did show that the number of respondents who said they saw someone outside of their home every day or almost every day went from the 45 to 3 when put in the context of before and during COVID respectively. So I'd like to kind of frame today's presentation with two papers, two quotes. And the first one is from an article that's recently been published by Chappell and Welsh, and this focused on so-called older people and how in times of wider socio-economic and policy pressures, resilience can be fostered at individual levels. The second quote is one that's recently been extracted from a report on emotional resilience in social workers. And I think what they both chime together with is the idea that relationships and a relational understanding of resilience is core to appreciating how we think about TED activities. And it's at the very centre of today's presentation. And I think the themes that I'm going to cover today will also provide some practical tips of how we can enhance resilience in communities from the position of providers as well as policymakers. And I hope that the quotes also kind of reflect the diverse nature of the communities and the work that we do. If we go on to the next slide, please. So if relationships are our mechanism for promoting resilience, today I'm going to focus on 4 core thematic areas. Findings from this work has particular implications for accessing, supporting, but perhaps most importantly, understanding the communities that we work with. The 4 themes that I outlined today are not insulated from each other. They interact and they hopefully have synergies with some of the other presentations that have been taking place this afternoon. They're grounded in the work of TED, from age-friendly businesses, friendship groups, and the diverse projects of our 5 delivery partners, and also our more recent connected offer as we moved into a transition stage during COVID. The first theme focuses on how services reach out through person-centred work and how this is important in building relationships. The first theme also shows that sometimes we refer to groups as hard to reach, when that really does shift focus onto beneficiaries to engage rather than services to innovate. The second theme also explores how activities are important mechanisms for attracting people to events and bringing people together. This learning includes place-based meetings and events before COVID, as well as learning from virtual or remote events during lockdown. And these can be held via social media, conference calls, as well as some socially distanced visits. Theme 3 concerns how the role of local awareness builds credibility in social networks, and how this is vital in engaging people over time, aged 50 and over. And it also intersects strongly with the final theme, which we've heard a lot about today, which regards digital inclusion. And this is featured quite frequently in Aging Better reports, the work of our 13 Aging Better partners, as well as the TED programme specifically. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the first slide, each thematic slide that I introduce will kind of spell out the core dimensions of each theme, along with some key quotes from the research exercises that I spoke about. Our work in East Lindsey is underpinned primarily by the time taken to understand and reach people in our communities before the pandemic, and the longevity of funding and the wider Aging Better programme has given a really distinct opportunity to do this since 2015. The relationships that TED has developed in earlier years have been and remain crucial to ensure ongoing engagement with our communities, as well as understanding the people that we work with, as I touched on before. This understanding is the bedrock, really, of person-centred services, especially where services have to adapt rapidly to COVID. So these are not just crucial in bouncing back, these relationships are also crucial in planning ahead and moving forward beyond COVID if the opportunity arises. And all our learning reports that are featured on our website indicate the personalised way in which TED works with people aged 50 and over. COVID's highlighted how important this is in designing and providing a mix of service offers. For instance, friendship groups, delivery partners, have all included one-to-one and group contact in a variety of ways, and this includes, for instance, digital support, telephone contact, and wellbeing visits. And this is a blended approach, and Ruth Bamford touched upon this earlier in the session about how these modes of support have helped people get food and essential to also move into communities of interest and developing sporting memories and quizzes, as some of our providers have done. Engagements also included working with different parts of the community, and the dimensions that feature on each of the slides are also routes to inform how we can develop policy and inform policy on a wider scale. And this again is reflective of the test and learn approach of Aging Better and TED as well. In the context of person-centred work, TED's commissioned projects that are focused specifically on men. We've recognised since programme inception, and this is a national issue as well, I think, that men have been required more innovative ways to engage in service provision. And like the programme as a whole, these services work with service users, collaborating and co-designing and developing a further insight not only into needs but also kind of preferences of communities. And the theme, this just as a final point on this theme, the idea is also accompanied by some research that Dr. Anna Tarrant has done at the University of Lincoln. Anna's work primarily centres on young fathers, but I think what TED has shown is that people are not necessarily hard to reach when when services reach out and engage with them innovatively. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So as I've probably just indicated, activities have been essential in engaging communities and also maximising and continue to maximise the relationships between people in groups and across communities. All of the case studies that we received from delivery partners emphasise the role of activities and also the accompanying word of mouth that promotes their engagement. Services have adopted partnership approaches before COVID and especially during COVID. So they've been able to cross-refer and promote different aspects of TED service delivery. And to return to male service users, projects such as Men Do, which is run by Carers First, and other projects such as Magna Vitae's Chaps have recognised that diverse activities are core to engaging men when more traditional coffee mornings may not have led to their engagement. And our telephone interviews have also highlighted how group members are initiating and designing activities and showing self-sustaining traits. And this has been in part credit to the kind of prior resource and support that TED supplied friendship groups in the form of a friendship officer. And this contact is going to be crucial in further supporting the transition to full self-sustainability. For instance, other examples of their innovation includes friendship groups maintaining in contact with other members of their groups and looking out for what they perceive as quite vulnerable people. So importantly, though, and perhaps crucially to how we engage service users, the activities that TED has run are not necessarily seen as a support need. They're a draw, as Liz has talked about from the University of Lincoln. So in that sense, the draw to the service is not necessarily somebody who is seen as needy or dependent on the services. And they've continued to use different methods to kind of continue engaging these individuals during the time of COVID. So the delivery partners, particularly in their case studies, highlighted that there's been a snowball effect really with individuals taking part in activities, that this kind of rolls on to other friends and contacts joining in. And the test and learn approach that TED and Aging Better takes to evaluation is mirrored in how activities are designed and delivered in collaboration. And that kind of fits in with some perspectives of action research, where there's elements of observation, action and reflection, and how this interplays between frontline practice as well as evaluation. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So the prior themes that have looked at person-centeredness and the role of engaging people through activities, and this theme emphasises on the role of credibility and how this relates to social networks and local awareness. All of our evaluation and monitoring exercises support the idea that grassroots activity has been instrumental in accessing our communities, both in the short term and the long term. Projects engage with service users over time, and this has given real insight into how the complexities of needs, as well as individuals' preferences and strengths, come to be known strategically as well as locally. Our learning has showed, for instance, that when services are seen to have buy-in to the communities, developed through time, activities and person-centred approaches, this has got other snowball effects, generating credibility through wider networks and not just with people aged 50 and over. And perceptions of localised and historical delivery are also important, along with shared experience and empathy to service users, which are demonstrated by providers. And some of this includes aspects of support that involve peers and also reciprocal relationships. And if we can move on to the next slide. So national and local learning has kind of shown an increasing amount of people, or a perception that a number of people aged 50 and over have moved towards interest in digital inclusion and digital skills as a result of the pandemic. Access to digital skills have been created through promoting activities, interests and support, rather than necessarily seeing the upskilling of a particular group of people as the primary aim. For instance, at the beginning of the presentation, I looked at an article by Chaplin Welsh, and this specifically cites digital inclusion in older people's resilience and healthy and stroke active ageing. And this particularly relates to keeping in contact with communities of interest and families and friends. So while there's been a preference for return place-based services, in our work and in some of the field work that we've undertaken. Some of the service offers that we have been managed to replicate using kind of social media platforms and communication online. And this has also focused on how we design future services. For instance, the use of telephone and digital and less place-based methods has also reached beneficiaries that may not have engaged with the traditional place-based activities that TED had established. And the case studies from our delivery partners, for instance, really do emphasise also the ability of delivery partners to be sustainable. They've engaged in a rapid change of service delivery, and they've offered one-to-one out-of-hours services along with group activities. And even where people aren't able to or not capable of accessing digital solutions, there's been evidence to suggest from our case studies that if one person of a network can access digital information, they will then use that to print off hard copy information and still engage members of group activities. So the prior themes kind of inform how we can reach communities when they don't have digital capabilities. And they also emphasise that there's some intersection between each of the themes in how we kind of go about reaching people. And finally, I'd just like to focus on the final slide. The four themes interact, and as a result, TED continues to reach communities. These relationships are crucial to resilience and recovery and to programme legacy and sustainability. TED provides strategic added value through its grassroots interface. And this is influential not only in kind of understanding the needs of communities, but also in developing a relationship where we see the nature of needs shift over time. And delivery partners have reported on this in case studies and also in some interviews. And they also, the themes also act as levers, as a mechanism for also managing the expectations of beneficiaries. And that's particularly important, I think, where there may have been previous climates where community development initiatives have not met the expectations of people in communities. So due to the cumulative effect of these themes, I would say TED's in a distinctive position to influence resilience and recovery, but also at a policy level. And I think that's me. So thank you. I'll hand back to Michelle, and I think got some questions. Yes.
Well, thanks ever so much for that, Hayden. And I think the learning reports are all published and are really fascinating to read. So I really encourage people to have a look at those. I'm hoping then at this stage our speakers are still all on the call, and that the Janes have had time to go through the questions and comments and are in a position to put those to the panel. So I'm going to hand over, and not being in the same room, I'm really relying on the technology to work for us here. So hopefully this will work. Over to you, Jane and Jane.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We have, between the two of us, kind of collated some of the questions. There are quite a lot of generalised comments, so we will take those on board, and perhaps they're not necessarily questions, but things that we can look at and reflect on after this event. So the first question is aimed for Ruth Bamford. There are kind of sort of two questions within this one. I apologise. So the first one is how do the TED activities compare to other Aging Better programmes, and what might influence your answer on that is another linked one, which is, would rural and coastal sparsity be a factor here perhaps, and have we considered twinning with other rural coastal settlements? So I am sorry for that one, but it's how do TED activities compare to other Aging Better programmes? Ruth. Hopefully, Ruth, can you hear us? And if you can unmute.
Did we mention test and learn at all? Digital divide, there it is in operation. Yeah, it's. I'm trying to decide how technical to get. I suppose I'd refer you to one of my earlier points, which was that there isn't one Aging Better model that's being developed, that's then being delivered in 14 areas. It's very much what TED decided to commission. So in some ways there are some activities that are similar, and in some ways you're quite different. So for example, other areas are doing, historically, TED, you had more of a formal befriending mechanism. So you linked people up, and I think that's become more informal as the whole program has learned. So I'm being very general now, but I think what we've learned is that you can't prescribe friendship. What you can do is create the environment where natural friendships develop, and that's part of that, building the connections. And I think, and so all of the areas have developed ways in doing that. Another very specific example is your age-friendly business work, and which is there are 2 other areas that are doing similar type work in working with businesses, but yours is you started doing that right from the beginning, and that's been really quite unique in the way that approach has developed. What was your second part of the question? There are other rural areas in the Aging Better programme, and so your question about twinning, I mean, you probably couldn't say this, but I can. One of the fantastic things about the Aging Better programme is the real support and sharing that's developed between all 14. So I know that you are working and in contact with Torbay, that's another coastal one, that Cheshire, which has got some rurality issues and things like that. So I know there's some fantastic partnership working and learning within the programme, and that we're now in that process of which this session is one of those, is now about disseminating and sharing all of that learning. I hope that goes some way to answering some of that question.
Amy, is there anything else you want to add from a TED perspective with regard to that question?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to really kind of consolidate what Ruth has said, in that the beauty of the Aging Better programs is that they've been able to be tailored to place. So although, you know, we are quite different to some of the other areas, we are all obviously addressing the same thing. So we're all working with the same age group, and we're all predominantly looking at addressing loneliness and isolation. Majority of the programs are working around social, around friendship. So there are absolutely some key themes. I think the test and learn nature of the programs has meant that actually some of those themes and issues have become more aligned as the programs have progressed. So for instance, Ruth did mention the age-friendly business work. So Jane and myself have both been working with our national partners around centralising some of that work and actually sharing what's worked in Lincolnshire with some of the other areas, including those areas that don't have age-friendly business models. So I think it's that there's no simple answer to that question. That there are similarities, but we are all very distinctly different in how we tackle those.
Super, thank you, Amy and Ruth. Hopefully that's answered some of those questions that were put up. Ruth, I do have another one. So while we're on you, I just thought it's a question for you. Which elements of the Better Ageing programs across the country do you think have the opportunity to be most sustainable in the longer term?
I think I suppose it will follow on from Amy's. I feel very passionately that it's not about there is an age, that there are some key principles to Aging Better. So person-centered, holistic, but then it is very much about doing the right thing for the right place. So I really don't think we're about a model. and I'd go back to the ecosystem. So I think what Aging Better will do is say the things that the approaches that work are this, and these are the things that you need in your locality, in your ecosystem, and that it's then about each area, geographical area, and it could be a street, a local authority. It's about looking at which parts of that are already present in your ecosystem and building on those. And then where there are gaps, it's about filling those or encouraging partnerships to work together to deliver those. I mean, some of those key principles are the co-production, co-research, co-design with people aged over 50. I keep saying person-centered, holistic, longer term funding. That's an absolute key message we've had. Short-term funding, that just can't help develop a community, because you need to be in place for a while. And I've talked about that role of a connector. Is another key thing that I think you need, and that we will be saying is absolutely essential. And having a network of partners on the ground that have developed that trust and that way of working. I don't think I said it when I was talking about COVID, but what in all 14 areas, as COVID came in, one of the things that all of them were able to do was move delivery really quickly. And in the befriending hub, in the emergency hubs, they've been able to work with partners to get those emergency services up and running, but also because they've got that network of partnerships, they've been able to work with people to get them to the mental health support, to get them to CABs, other agencies that can help with financial advice or debt. And it's about maximizing what's already in a locality so that an individual gets the right kind of support. And I suppose, what about the sustainability is it is about having, I'd put the plea out, and it's for us as well as funders, but all funders and commissioners, it's about, it's similar to social prescribing. Social prescribing is great, but it will fall down if there isn't the things in the community for people to prescribe to. And so it's about looking at what's in place for that community locally.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I know that Jane, the other, it's confusing, isn't it? Because there's two Janes, but the other Jane is going to ask a question.
Okay, Jane B and Jane A. Okay, so this one is initially for Hayden, but it might be that the other speakers may want to comment on it. So Hayden, this is from Julie Green. Has there been any feedback on the way in which people access information and advice about services? Where, by which methods? So the example given, digital. So it's the digital question again. It's how people are getting the information.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think there are those people out there who have preferences for different type of social media. I think what we found in TED is that a lot of the people aged 50 and over prefer Facebook to, say, Twitter. But I think some of it also has to do with the networks that we've developed in face-to-face services and how they act as kind of gatekeepers for people accessing digital applications. So this has been particularly relevant with some of the work that our delivery partners have done, Links Digital, for instance, looking at getting people essentials during lockdown. So kind of using those local relationships, those really good reputations to kind of engage with people, to kind of feed them in to take up digital skills. I think some of the case studies have also shown that kind of word of mouth and some of the preferences of service users have included conference calls. So there's not been a sole reliance on kind of online technology. Conference calls have been really good in engaging small groups of peer support and kind of camaraderie during our services. And I think some of that has picked up in delivery case studies by Carers First and Magna Vitae as well.
Thank you. Did any of the other speakers want to add to that about feedback on the way people have actually got information, accessed information? Are we happy?
Can I add to that, Jane? Is that okay?
Cool, yeah.
So I just wanted to add that actually by offering our services in a more blended way, so offering a digital offer as well as the telephone and postal offer, we've actually seen new people come to us. So people that perhaps couldn't have accessed services in a non-digital format can access them with a digital. So I think it's been quite interesting, but I do think what is quite clear is that a blended approach is what's needed, and that actually that this is something that we will continue to push forward with beyond recovery.
Okay, thank you. Jane, do you have another question?
I do, and this question is to Ivan, and it's a question from Michelle. Could you give a view on the value and importance of a focus on better ageing in the context of economic recovery post-COVID? It seems there is an important opportunity to articulate the economic value of supporting people to age well across all that we do.
No pressure there then. That's a nice simple question, Michelle. Thank you for that. I think we've got lots of information that suggests that self-directed care and people living independently for longer can make a big contribution to the public purse in driving down the cost of delivering more acute services. And so the work TED does both around people's physical but also around their mental health and well-being is really important. And that's why I've really enjoyed doing the social return on investment work, because you can start to infer some values for that more difficult piece around mental health and well-being. And I think making sure that we reference those kind of outcomes with organisations that have got an interested economy locally, like the Local Enterprise Partnership, is quite important. They see health and care as a priority, but I don't think they think about it in community terms. I think they think about it more in terms of traditional business metrics. So I think there's scope for a really interesting dialogue with them. I also think there's a really interesting discussion to be had about making TED a national exemplar, and perhaps with some of the other 14 sites, thinking about the learning that they're generating about the impact that they're having on mental health and well-being and people living independently, to see if we could perhaps develop something which was a bit more far-reaching. It could be a key agenda item for a future networking session amongst the different settlements. But I think it goes without saying that if we can demonstrate the social value of initiatives like TED, and if we can think a bit more insightfully about putting some direct numbers on those preventive outcomes that it's delivered, we can make a really strong case. And let's not forget that actually quite a few people who are TED participants are still potentially economically active in their own right as well. So there's that element. And also there's a final element to do with building on things like the age-friendly business work and engaging businesses. So I think there's a big piece around economy and TED that merits further investigation, and something that perhaps we ought to keep, in the short medium view, because I think we probably naturally will concentrate on some of the other outcomes around it. So I think it's a really important issue.
Thank you, Ivan. Hopefully that's answered your question, Michelle. I know we've got one more question, which Jane B is going to ask.
Okay, I can't but help, we're a bit like the two Ronnies, but two Janes. Anyway, showing my age there. Okay, so this was a question that was posed by Tracy Wilkinson, and it's for Natalie. And it was a question that came up in your session, Natalie. And it's looking at the results of your survey. Tracy observed that it was interesting that the majority believed their finances would remain unchanged. The question is, do you think the impact of the pandemic hasn't been fully realised?
Short answer, yes, or no, whichever way. No, I don't think the full impact has been realised. So I think this was done, the survey was done in May. So things may have changed for people, I think, but there are, for a lot of people for who've already made preparations in later life, or their income hasn't been affected. If you think 50% are key workers, most key workers who are still continuing to have a really valuable role to play in the economy, of those who are working, I think it's a mix of people who'd already retired and were doing okay, and those people who were already in work and who didn't see a problem. But I think it's true that as October has neared, those people who were furloughed or in insecure work are more aware, and also people in terms of hospitality and tourism, which, you know, disproportionately affects coastal and rural areas as well, are becoming aware that actually recovery is not a bounce, as you've called in your title. So I think it's a mix of all of those things. Some people are going to be okay, and they're more concerned about their children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, but others for whom, yeah, it's only just becoming apparent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we've covered some of the questions that have been asked via chat. As I said earlier, there are quite a few comments, and we will take those forward and review after the event. But if you have any more questions throughout the remainder of this time of the event, or likewise if you have any questions when you get a post-presentation pack, which I know there's been a few questions on chat about, then please don't hesitate to contact us, and we will endeavour to get those questions answered by whoever we feel it is right to answer those questions, and we will respond to those after the event. So if everyone is okay, I'll hand back to Michelle.
Thank you very much for that. Really, just to finish from me, a huge thank you to all of you for attending and for contributing today. I know it's a really different way of doing it via Zoom, but I really hope you found it interesting and helpful. If you have, and if you'd like to learn more, please do keep an eye out for those follow-up learning events, which I understand will be quite specific on the various elements of the programme, and they'll be hosted over the coming weeks. I've mentioned a couple of times those learning reports, and there are also some emerging toolkits, and they're really designed to ensure that those learnings from TED can be shared and replicated elsewhere. For example, the age-friendly business model really is gaining momentum in East Lindsey, and there's a toolkit nearing completion that really can support the implementation of that model elsewhere. We've talked a lot about testing, learning, moving things forward, and we're now exploring how age-friendly businesses can become age-friendly employers, how they can support people to stay in work, to go back to work. Really, really interesting area of work emerging there, and also in some of the other areas across the country. And similarly, we know that there is really fantastic work happening elsewhere across the county and beyond. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we'd love to hear more about your own work. And as we look towards a Lincolnshire-wide focus on better ageing, these insights will be really, really key. So just some reflections on what we've heard today. We know that people are living longer, and clearly it is in all of our interests to embrace and support an ageing population if we're going to help each other to maximise healthy, happy and active lives, which is what we really, really all want to aspire to have. It is an opportunity for us to make sure collectively we prepare people for later life and give people the best chance of having those choices and opportunities. We've heard today about the value of prevention, preparedness, innovation, flexibility, and critically of working with people in our communities to design, to implement, and then to test and learn the ways that we work. We've heard about key challenges facing our ageing population, so loneliness, isolation, digital and system access, and the importance of giving people the confidence to navigate and access some of those opportunities, whether they are digital or otherwise, in, as we've heard, a really rapidly changing environment. And I think none of us could have predicted just how quickly things had changed and how we would need to respond to that over recent months. We've heard a lot about the value of volunteers and the opportunity to harness the enthusiasm and willingness that's been shown by our communities during the COVID response, and that role of communities, community resilience, and the role of connectors, which is key. And I think for all of us that work across Lincolnshire, we will have seen how amazingly our volunteers and our communities have stood up to really help. And I think that's something to be really proud of. And it's really interesting to see the face-to-face contact elements reflected in the Ipsos Mori research as well. So there were some real challenges for ageing in a rural and coastal area, but there are some real positives as well. The scale of older people working as key workers was really interesting to me, and it's obviously been highlighted as being greater than other areas across the country. So I think for us, sort of taken away from today, it's important to consider how we really focus on keeping people in work, to help them back into work, or to help them to reskill and move into roles that are appropriate to them as we move forwards. Age-friendly employment seems to be a really key opportunity, and it's absolutely one that's of interest to us in East Lindsey. We also heard through Natalie's presentation in particular some of the real insights and challenges around housing, and I hope that we can spend some time looking further into those so that we properly understand them and can respond to what's needed and what's important in our local areas. And again, just really reflecting on some of the evidence strengths in our communities too. I think it's really important that we shout about those. We've got a lot to be proud of in Lincolnshire. So huge thank you to all of our speakers for your time, your expertise today, and a massive thank you to the whole TED team. And by TED team, I mean the network of partners, the volunteers and beyond. I know it's a real collaborative effort. Before we finish, I just wanted to go back to the so what point, and with a real focus on people, because last year I was fortunate enough to join some of the TED volunteers over Christmas dinner, which was hosted by one of the age-friendly businesses. And I was absolutely blown away that day by the difference being involved in TED had made to some of those people. So for some, it was an opportunity to give back, to stay active and to try something new and be part of a wider, resilient network, and you could really see the friendship and the strong attachments and bonds that had formed between the volunteers. But for others, and this is what really took my breath away, it had been a real lifeline and an opportunity for some people who actually had significant life changes such as bereavement or retirement, and had really got them feeling that they were part of something again, and you can't put a price on that. That's really important. We believe in East Lindsey in supporting people to live and age well, and we'll constantly try to find ways to do that across all of our services and all of our partnerships. We really hope that you found some of what you've heard today useful, and if you've heard anything that you found you'd like more information on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of the team. For now, I wish you really safe journeys home downstairs, and thank you ever so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thank you very much. Goodbye.